Hello, everybody. My name is Robert Corvus. I'm a science fiction writer, and in my science fiction stories, I like to travel between the stars in starships. So that's why that is a topic that I often think about and that I often put my mind around. And I want to share some thoughts on starships with you. So this is not a technical presentation. It's nothing about engineering or something like that. I would like to talk from the perspective of a writer, of an author who thinks about the stories he wants to write and the elements that might make these stories a bit more interesting, especially when it comes to starships. If we look at the vessels that we know today, like um, when we cross the sea, like the conventional ships, we find a lot of different types of ships. An aircraft carrier obviously looks completely different from a fishing trawler or from a cruise ship or from other kinds of ships. And that's because these ships serve different purposes. So that's the general question that we have to ask ourselves all the time when we want to design a spaceship is why do we want to have that ship? Or to be more precise, the person inside our fictional universe in our story who ordered that ship to be built. Why did he want that ship to be built? So this ship will have a purpose, and it will be built to purpose. It's a difference if we have an explorer ship that would have a large section for science, for scientists, maybe storage room for probes that they would collect on different planets, and a lot of instruments that they can use to examine things. That's completely different from, let's say, a casino vessel where you would invite rich folk and you would be interested to always keep them in good mood, and you would of course offer shows and gambling facilities where you want to get their money. So that would have a heavy investment on entertainment facilities and maybe luxury quarters and maybe other quarters for the staff on the casino vessel, and not so much laboratories and instruments and storage facilities for exotic specimen. And you can think about what kind of purpose does my ship serve? And therefore you need or get already an idea of what kind of facilities do I need on my spaceship. So do I have a troop transport who would only carry for a limited amount of time very densely packed troops to a planetary surface, heavily armored, maybe weaponized, whatever? Or do I have an unmanned probe, which is also kind of a spaceship? So this is something that as like kind of a preface I want to give as a thought to you, that we always have to consider why does this ship exist in the first place. So now I want to browse through different components of the spaceship that we want to consider. The maybe most important factor is there life on board? Do we have a crew? If we have a crew, do we have this crew everywhere on board? Do they move all across the ship? Or do we have special crew sections and other sections, maybe the bigger part of the ship, where never somebody would be present, at least not according to plan. So they should be in their crew section, And then we would have like the engine section, the fuel tank, maybe the cargo bay, and all of these would be during spaceflight, not be inhabited. So that makes that makes an opportunity, gives an opportunity for interesting stories, like for blind passengers that might want to sneak into the cargo bay because they know nobody will be looking there for them. But then they have to take care of their own life support, and that might be a major issue as well. So wherever you have regular crew presence, you would have life support. And that's probably an expensive thing, and it's probably something that takes up a lot of logistics and a lot of space and a lot of machinery. Think about it. You need water, you need food. You might want to have an atmosphere. You definitely want to have an atmosphere that allows people to breathe and just exist. So with an appropriate amount of pressure on board and the appropriate amount of oxygen or whatever they need. That's the next question. Do you have only humans as a crew or life forms that have the same or similar needs as humans have? Or do you have other life forms that, for example, don't need oxygen, but they need sulfur or something else, some other element to function? So that would be an interesting setting. So you might have sections inside the crew section that accommodate for exotic atmospheres, or you would have some portion of the crew always wearing spacesuits or breathing devices or things like that. And you can take that further and say, we don't have an atmosphere of air, of some kind of air, but we have aquatic creatures as well. So they would be surrounded by water. Think about David Brent's novels with these neo-dolphins. They have very special needs. At least from our perspective, they are special. From their perspective, of course, it's the normal environment. Do you want to have artificial gravity? That's a major question that I will get to multiple times during this presentation. Gravity is a mysterious force. So we, as of today, haven't understood it at all. We just know it exists. What we could imagine for the purpose of our story is that we create something similar like gravity by rotating devices, so rotogravitation, but then you have gravity only on the outside of the rotating device. So that determines the shape of your spaceship. Or by acceleration. So you simulate gravity by acceleration, but then you have to accelerate all the time. And if you stop accelerating, you're suddenly in zero gravity. In general, for all areas that you would have crew, life forms on board, you would have a huge demand on three-dimensional space in there, especially if you want to simulate gravity to some extent. Then you have a floor and a ceiling that are more or less useless, so you can just use it for walking, or it's just there and maybe some light elements are attached there and that's it. And you use up a lot of space for life support in general, for example, agricultural facilities or living quarters or sleeping quarters or socializing quarters, whatever you want to name it. So you have to invest in a lot of space for that crew, especially if the ship is designed for a long-term voyage. So if it's not just a couple of hours or a couple of days that you spend on board, but maybe months or years that you spend on board, then people must be somewhat comfortable on board. But let's talk about gravity. Gravity is something we are used to, something that we need in some respect. So if we don't have gravity, our body will adjust to a zero-G environment. If we don't have artificial gravity, it might be that there are facilities on board that allow us to train against the adverse effects of zero gravity, like degeneration of our skeleton, of our bones, muscles. You can see on our today's International Space Station, for example, there are facilities for the astronauts to train against these effects. So would we have that on our ship as well? Or would we have some kind of really have artificial gravity like we have in most science fiction movies, at least? That would imply, and the question is, how far do we want to live with this implication? But that would imply that we could use gravity more or less as a commodity equipment. So, for example, we probably wouldn't have conventional escalators or lifts or ladders. We would have kind of anti-grav tubes where we just float up and down to other decks of the ship. Anti-gravity, or the possibility to cope with gravity in an artificial way, is also a prerequisite for maneuvering at very fast speeds. You can think, if you want to accelerate a ship up to light speed in a short time, you would have enormous pressure inside that ship that would probably crush the bones of the people on board if you want to have it in a short time. Same if you want to change direction, maybe in a space battle, abruptly. So that could crash the crew and every piece of equipment on board. But if you have artificial gravity, then you could imagine that everything on board is in that field of artificial gravity, and they wouldn't feel like the acceleration in one direction or the other. And that might also be a plot device if you decide that this facility, that engine, that device that creates the artificial gravity is sabotaged or damaged for some other reason, then that might make this spaceship a lame duck in the midst of a space battle. It can't maneuver in a fast way. It just can accelerate in the ways that we are used to today. So that could be an interesting story device as well. If you master artificial gravity, you might think about something like a tractor beam. So you project gravitational force outside of your ship, onside another vessel or an asteroid or whatever you have there, and can pull that towards you. So that, and hold it maybe there as well. That might be another application and another piece of equipment on your spaceship. And thought even further, you might use the gravity itself as a weapon. Think about a boarding crew, an enemy boarding crew on your ship, and you might isolate the section that they are in and then put the gravity up 500%, 1000%. So then you can make them maybe immobile on board by just putting additional weight on them. Or maybe you can project gravity outside of your ship to another vessel and crush that vessel just by the force of gravity, like being crushed by an invisible fist. It's also a fascinating thought, I find. I already talked about artificial gravity being useful for mitigating effects of acceleration. So propulsion in general is a good question or a good topic that we should think about for building our spaceship. So first of all, we have sublight propulsion. So we want to navigate usually inside of a planetary system. There are basically two ways to do that. The one is that we know today we can push whatever we have, the spacecraft, and today we usually do that by some kind of rocket. So also the jet engines that we have built in on the spaceship are more or less a miniature rocket, if you like that. But of course, to bring them into orbit, you can watch a start of some Dragon or space shuttle or from Baikonur or from Ariane spaceport. They always use rockets to push something up. You could also imagine to do it with like a catapult, maybe a magnetic catapult. Here you have the spaceship inside that catapult and then accelerated and shot basically towards the target. Next question is, how do you stop once you reach your destination? So do you have something like on an aircraft carrier where you have to catch the planes that are landing with some landing device there? That's the question you would have to answer then. But you don't that's not the only option to push something. In science fiction, we can also imagine to pull a ship. And especially if you have artificial gravity, you could imagine to have a microscopic black hole in front of the ship, and it pulls the ship towards that gravitational force. So that might be an idea as well. None of the concepts that we can even imagine today allows us to go faster than light. If we want that in our story, and in many stories we do want that, we usually have the concept of hyperspace. And that comes in two flavors. One is that we say that's another medium that we can navigate through. So we fly through hyperspace. We can experience and interact with hyperspace. Maybe there are living beings there as well. Maybe we can encounter other ships inside hyperspace as well. Or we say that's a concept, but we basically jump through it. We don't experience it. We just dematerialize at the one end and we come out at the other end of the travel. And in between, there's nothing that we can experience. That's something that's basically in our story dependent on do we wish to have that as a plot device? Do we have the desire to describe the voyage through hyperspace, or do we want to tell a story that is on planet A and then the story would continue on planet B and it's of no interest what happens in between? Then we can do just the jump thing. That's very close to the translocation or projection idea, which is more like that you have not the ship itself that has this jump drive, but it has to go to some jump station or whatever, and then can get out at the destination station. But in general, faster than light travel is not possible inside the restraints that we know for the Einsteinian universe. Therefore, we need to establish some place or some medium or some way where these laws of Einstein don't apply, which then would be hyperspace, usually. We all know from our cars, we need gasoline or diesel or any kind of fuel. And it's a plausible assumption that our spaceship would need some kind of fuel as well. So today we have chemical fuels, which is what we use most of the time. We could also imagine nuclear fuels, or nuclear drives. So where we need some reaction mass like uranium or plutonium or so ever to fuel our engine. And we can think about antimatter as well in science fiction. It's expected that a reaction from matter and antimatter would just leave pure energy, so it would be extremely energetic reaction. That has some implication for your overall story. If you have an antimatter drive, the natural next question would be, do you also have an antimatter bomb? Which is then much, much more potent than a nuclear bomb would be. So is this a world where we have this kind of nearly planet killer weapons? That's something you would have to answer in your story if you decide I have antimatter drives. You can also make up any kind of fuel if you don't want to deal with these questions. You can make up that something new has been discovered that we don't even think about today, and it follows exactly the requirements that you need for your story to tell your story. One thought worth exploring is as well, where do you get whatever kind of fuel you need for your spaceship? Is it something that you harvest your own? So like the spaceship flying through an atmosphere of a gas giant and collecting hydrogen or whatever it is that they need for their tanks? Is it something that you buy? If it is so, is there something like an interstellar gas station? How do you pay for it? Would they be willing to trade with you or not? So that could be a plot device as well. And if they don't want to trade fuel to you, maybe you want to steal it. Maybe it's a precious commodity anyway, so it's something worth stealing. And the plot of your story is to steal a tanker with fuel for spaceships. And when you have this fuel on board, where do you store it? What kind of tank do you need? This comes back to the different kinds of fuel. So if you want to have antimatter on board, you better isolate it from everything else on board, because everything else on board is matter. So matter, antimatter, probably on the first touch would have generated a big explosion and nothing would be left but pure energy. How durable and how stable is your fuel? So does it have to be used or just goes away? Like in a hydrogen tank, you would have a loss over time. Would it be something that has to be monitored all the time, like nuclear components? That could make story elements from the danger of that fuel itself. Let's look at the engines. So fuel goes into an engine, and what does this engine look like? Does it take a lot of space of this aircraft? So this, if you look at the tank again today, the spacecraft we know, these rockets, they are mainly composed of the tank. That's the major part of the spacecraft. But maybe for a hyperspace drive, it's the engine. Might be. That might make for an interesting setting as well. So think about somebody hiding between huge, really huge engine blocks, like engines as high as skyscrapers. So people might live between these engine blocks and they might be tolerated there because it's too much effort to get them out. Or ship might be boarded by an enemy force and you might have laser gun fights between the engines, and that might be dangerous because they might explode. Another question for this engine is, do we need an engineer on board? So a guy like Geordie LaForge, is there still some human supervision necessary for these engines to operate? So that might make an interesting character, especially in science fiction stories where we have kind of, we like science guys and we like engineer guys as well. So do we have engineers on board? What do they do? Why doesn't the engine operate on itself? What is a typical task for an engineer on board? Maybe we also need, from time to time, external maintenance. We need to go to a workshop and get an uplift on our machine or some parts exchanged or whatever. And that's all of these where we need something is always a good plot device. It's always the potential of conflict with a guy or who could give or withhold the service from us. Of course, a ship has a hull, so the outer boundary of that ship. The shape of the hull will be determined primarily by the question if this ship should move inside a planetary atmosphere or not. So do we have to think about aerodynamics or don't we? Most spacecraft that we build today do not think about aerodynamics. They just fly in open space, like the Voyager probes or whatever. So if we want to go in an atmosphere, either we would have a hull that would take care of aerodynamics, or we would have some other solution to shield our ship from the impacts of high-speed entry into an atmosphere. That could be energetic shields, for example. The fascinating thing about not having thought about aerodynamics is that we have all fascinating shapes of spaceship, all exotic shapes of spaceship that are possible. Think about the Borg cube, for example, in Star Trek. Thinking about the hull, the natural question is which purpose does it serve, or to put it in other words, what happens if the hull is damaged and cannot serve its purpose anymore? Usually in open space, we would experience radiation from every star that we pass. That radiation would have impact on the crew. It could also have impact on advanced technology on board. Another thing that the hull usually supports is pressure on board, like atmosphere. If the hull is punctured, we would lose atmosphere. We would be in danger of not being able to breathe anymore on board and die in the end. That can also be a dramatic thing for our story, to lose atmosphere over time, not all at once, but have some small holes in there, maybe lose some sections on the spaceship. That could make for good drama. Think about somebody being in one part of the ship and his loved one being in the other, and one of these sections then loses pressure, and you have to decide on when to seal it, and therefore make sure that the other one would not be able to get back into safety but have to die because of loss of pressure. That's a common topic that you can use by thinking about damaging the hull. It could also be reduced maneuverability of the craft as a whole. The hull usually uses for the structural integrity of the ship. So if we fly fast maneuvers, it has to compensate for high pressures. And if it can't do that anymore, then we would be in danger if we would make a fast maneuver that our ship breaks apart. And that could put us into conflict again, especially during space battle or a scenario like that, or maybe even when we want to enter an atmosphere, maybe we can't do that before we do some repairs to the hull. One of the space shuttles tragically exploded because of a minor hull damage, and therefore the atmospheric impact tore it apart. One of the big tragedies of modern spaceflight. We can also use the ideas that we have for a hull of a spaceship when we design space suits for our crew. Because if you think about it, the hull protects the crew as a whole. And the spacesuit protects a crew of one, if you like. So a lot of things that the hull has to provide for the crew as a whole, a spacesuit has to provide for an individual. Of course, in our spaceship, we don't want to be blind. We want to interact with our surroundings, and we also want to maneuver this ship and operate its engines and its facilities. So not to be blind, like we have senses, we can smell, we can see, we can hear. A ship would have sensors, electronic and magnetic sensors, which is like the conventional thing, radar. All of these have one limitation, and that limitation is that they only go as fast as light. We already discussed that in space we usually have huge distances and high speeds. And in this combination, light speed censoring might not be good enough. If you think about something being as far away as 8 light seconds, that would mean you would have a delay of 8 seconds to detect whatever your enemy does. And if he does some fast maneuvering, you will never hit him, because he would be in a completely different space, hundreds of kilometers away, once you shoot at the area where you suspect him. So you can take that as a given and as a plot device and say, okay, we never know until we really meet at close distance where our enemy is. Or you can establish something like faster than light sensors, which would be science fiction technology, so you would have to make that up. One special variant of that could be psionic, so that with your mental capabilities of special crew members or maybe a special species that you might want to establish, you can sense mentally where your enemy is or about your surroundings. Maybe you can sense the thoughts of another crew, something like that. Another important aspect of information technology is the ship's computer. We often encounter artificial intelligence, which we assume would be much more effective and can make decisions on their own, especially if these decisions would have to be made faster than a human being could make it and could process information. Would that artificial intelligence have personality? Why? So is it a hindrance to have personality, or maybe personality is some prerequisite for, let's say, creativity that might be very useful for this kind of decisions that the artificial intelligence should make? If it has personality, whom is its loyalty to? The natural answer would be, okay, it has to be loyal to the captain of the ship. But thinking about it, why should you establish that if you could design an artificial intelligence? Wouldn't you, as the owner of the ship, not rather like it to be loyal to you? Or in a military vessel, loyal to the empire, or whatever that entity is that the military is working for. Maybe you have other interest groups. Maybe you would have the society to say our artificial intelligences to be approved, to be built into our spaceships, have to obey some moral standards, some ethical standards. So maybe that's also maybe some security measure against misuse of the ship. Maybe the captain wants to attack another vessel, but the artificial intelligence would block that. Maybe somebody would board the ship, but he can't hijack it because the artificial intelligence would stop the engines. Something like that. Maybe, of course, there's an error working in that artificial intelligence and it becomes the enemy of the crew or part of the crew. You can add some interesting flavor of irrationality even in there because of contradicting instructions. So we would assume that the computer would always calculate and be logic and be mathematically accurate, but that does not need to apply for the instructions that were given to that computer. And if these instructions are conflicting, then you might have an interesting story there. Another aspect is we want to interact with our surroundings, with the rest of the universe. We want to know what's going on and we want to tell them what's going on board our ship. So we want to have communications. We could have radio communications, which is what we have today. With that, we can relay audio and video signals, but we also would have transmission delay. Same thought that we already had a couple of minutes ago. It would take some time for the signal to travel. So maybe I want to ask a question and it takes 8 seconds to get to the receiver. They then would have to think about the answer, send it back, another 8 seconds. That might be an interesting story device as well, because it kind of isolates our starship. So all the important decisions have to be made on board the starship. It would take too long to make a conference with your superiors. That might be interesting for you. It also can be a hassle, of course. So it could be a hindrance, an obstacle to move your story ahead. So you have to think carefully what should be possible and what should not. You might want to have faster than light travel to get rid of this problem. And if you want to have that, you can have that for relatively short distance. So now I'm talking about inside a planetary system. Or you might want to have that, and that's a different story, between star systems. So huge, long distance, like a galactic empire that wants to have communication all around. That sounds like a good idea, and it's definitely comfortable for people living there. But it might be, you might lose some very nice story elements. If you don't have interstellar communications in real time, then you are kind of back to messenger ships. And that's a fascinating idea. That's like the time when the capital would send a sailing ship to the colonies for their instructions. The colonies would have an uprising, but you wouldn't know in the capital because first the messenger ship has to get back and relay that message. And of course, the messenger ship can be intercepted. And that kind of story makes for that's a good action story. That can be good action stories there. So think about if you might want to go for messenger ships instead of faster than light radio communications. You can also mix that, of course. You can say that you need special devices installed at sender and receiver for these faster than light radio, but systems that don't have that, they need the messenger ships, or it might be expensive to use one form of communication. And of course, you should think about encryption as well. So that's, if you wouldn't have any encryption in your radio communication, that would be strange to the reader because it's so common even today. Stories are made up of conflict, so a lot more often than not, you will have some kind of space battle if you have spaceships as a major plot device. These weapons you can think of as offense weapons and defense weapons. Offense weapons, everything that works with bullets or other kind of projectiles is a kinetic weapon. That's rather short range. So especially when you think about space battle. So it's not about 100,000 of kilometers, it's about a few kilometers that you would aim with a gun and just shoot. And think about kinetics as well as a factor in space battle. So you would hit something with a mass, with a bullet, maybe with a big bullet, that could impact the route that it takes, how it travels through space as well. You could have torpedoes. They could have their own drive, maybe even their own faster than light drive. So that might be interesting as well. Traditional weapon in science fiction is the laser. The laser doesn't have any kinetic impact. So if you hit something with the laser, you don't push it in any direction. It just continues on the route it travels. But you have an impact in the sense of heat, extreme heat if you have advanced lasers. So iron might or steel might have bubbles and effects like that you could describe. Another ideas are plasma throwers, of course, the gravity projector we talked about before. You could have faster than light weapons, which you usually have also in science fiction because of the huge distances you fight at. But that would imply, and that's a trade-off, it's more kind of realistic that in that scenario you would have faster than light weapons when you have very fast travel and very long distance. But that also would mean that the opponents probably wouldn't even see each other. They wouldn't know what hits them, right? So that's usually, from the drama perspective, it's not as advantageous as if you would look into the eye of your enemy, right? The opposite, of course, is if you don't just want to destroy the other vessel, but you want to capture it, then you probably want to board it. So again, we could have artificial gravity, tractor beam pulling it towards you. And then the question is, how do you get on board? Do you have a device like a tunnel or something that you can just punch through the hull and then go on board? Or would your troops use spacesuits and then fly over and somehow try to dig their way through the other hull? What kind of boarding device would you have there? And of course, you would have defensive weapons as well. First of all, the armor. So your hull, how much is it armored? How dense it is, how hard it is. Probably you would have shields, energy shields, which is also a common device in science fiction. It has a large advantage over armor, because armor, once it's damaged, you have to replace or repair it. Shields, when they get hit, usually they lose some energy, but you put in additional energy and then it's okay. So you don't have to do any repair work, usually, with shields. Sand throwers is the idea. Basically, you could also have other forms of glitter or whatever that you would use against lasers, because lasers are just light. So if you surround your ship with sand particles or any kind of particles, they would usually weaken the laser. Okay? And you can think about cloaking devices to make your ship invisible, which is also some very advanced science fiction technology that we don't have any idea about today. But that's an idea as well. A special thought could be made about explosions in space. Usually an explosion would be that you have something that grows in size very, very fast and pushes all the atmosphere around it to the sides, and that basically this is the impact of the explosion, that this atmosphere is pushed to the side. You can see that when you see pictures, especially of large explosions. In space, you don't have atmosphere. So all that travels from the source of the explosion is the material that is inside the warhead or inside the bomb. That can still have a lot of impact, like shrapnel, but you wouldn't have this kind of impact that, yes, that shock wave the explosion like an atmosphere does, or like water does, or like ground does. You just have nothing there that would relay that. So probably explosive devices in space are less effective than they are in a planetary battle, unless you directly hit your target. So a torpedo crashing into another spaceship and then exploding there, of course, that has major impact. So enough of violence and weapons and things. How does it feel to live aboard? Don't waste the opportunity that you put your story in a very exotic environment. What more exotic environment than space is there? So it should feel exotic. It should not feel like being in a hotel room in Manhattan. It should feel like being on a spaceship between the stars. How do crew quarters look like? Are there different kinds of quarters for workers on the ship, for passengers, for whatever? How does eating and life support work? Is it a pleasant thing to be on the ship? Or is it something where you have to eat just some astronaut food like they do today, where you can't have a real meal? And maybe that's a major thing that the people living aboard the spaceship are looking forward to when they visit a planet, that they can have real meals and real tables and things like that. How does leisure work? If you have a spaceship where people live for a year or longer, they need some leisure activities. Do they have cinemas, theaters, gyms? What is it? How do they spend their leisure time? Is there luxury on board as well, especially if it's a passenger ship? Or if it's a very large military vessel, maybe it's attractive to become an officer because you get some luxury, some bigger quarters or whatever there is possible. How would people sleep? Maybe for sleeping, zero gravity is a good idea. You don't get pressured anywhere on your body when you're just floating in zero gravity. Maybe that's the usual way to go to sleep there. Or is it hibernation? Hibernation chambers are cryo chambers, are usually described as stopping the aging process as well. So that could make for a great story if you say people go sleeping in a hibernation chamber, and then some accident or whatever happens, and they wake up hundreds of years later in a world alien to them. This archetype of the stranger is very important for science fiction stories because the stranger explores his new surroundings or gets them explained. And by this plot device, also the reader gets an introduction to the new environment. And the environment will be new to the reader because it's set in the far future or on a distant planet or whatever. So you need some way of introducing your science fiction world to the reader. And a hibernation chamber can help you with that. Are there prisons on board? What happens to mutiny peoples, to mutineers, to if there happens a crime or if you capture prisoners of war, what happens to them? And especially fascinating could be agricultural units. So if you want to have a self-sustaining ship that can basically fly forever and doesn't need any support from outside, then they have to grow their own food. And from a storyteller perspective, that's a fascinating environment. You would have outside the vastness of space, all black with the stars in it, and then maybe a transparent wall or dome, and inside you would have kind of a jungle where you grow the food. It's fascinating just from the imagination and can make for great setting for your story. Somebody hiding in this jungle area beneath the perfect sky of stars. Think about it. So far, I usually or mainly talked about big spaceships, where you would have one ship traveling through the universe with a crew of maybe 30, maybe 100 people or whatever, something like that size. Was my implicit assumption, but it doesn't have to be that way. You can upscale and downscale these ideas. You can think about very small vessels, which would usually have either a planet or a space station or a bigger vessel as a base. Not always, not in all stories, but in many stories. So they would have special tasks. You all know the fighter, the X-Wing fighter, for example, in Star Wars, or the fighters in Battlestar Galactica. So they would be manned by one person or two persons and would be especially designed for just shooting, bombing, whatever. Very agile, very fast, but in many cases not capable of faster than light travel. For that, they would be dependent on the main vessel. They wouldn't have agricultural facilities, of course, and things. So very specialized units, fighters. We would have maybe shuttles, especially if our main spaceship is not capable to land in an atmosphere. We would have some smaller vessels which would organize the travel to planet surface and back from planet surface. And then again, one of my favorite topics, artificial gravity. Do we have it on shuttles as well? If not, maybe it's a tough ride down, a tough ride up. Let's see. And we also know the escape pods as some small vessel as well. There are others, but these are just to give you some ideas. And you can upscale the idea of a spaceship as well, of course. You could have a whole fleet of spaceships, hundreds, thousands. And then the question is, what is the mission of the fleet? Is it a military fleet? Should it defend or conquer something? It is an explorationary fleet. Maybe the fleet is the home of that species because they lost their home planet. That could all be the case. So the fleet would have a mission. Maybe it's also a trading fleet for a long trading journey across the galaxy, hoping to come home in 30, 40 years with lots of goods and riches. Or a missionary fleet. All of that we have seen in history. But if you have a fleet, you can have very specialized vessels. You have some that are specialized in military tasks, some that are specialized in maintenance, that are flying workshops, some that are agricultural vessels. And the interesting thing for the storyteller in that is that you can have conflicts of interest between these kinds of vessels. So maybe the owners of the agricultural vessel, they want to raise price. Maybe there's a religious movement on one of the military vessels and they get some strange ideas out of that. Maybe one of the vessels doesn't want to go with the fleet anymore. They want to depart, but the other ships in the fleet, they depend on that vessel. So that can be really interesting for your story if you build a fleet on that. So, as some parting thoughts, I want to leave you with some exotic concepts. Maybe you don't want to build a ship, not as a whole, but you want to take an asteroid, you want to punch holes into it, which would then make the rooms. You would put some engines on this asteroid and say, that is my ship now. Why not? You might encounter some things you didn't expect at the core of the asteroid while in mid-travel. That might be an idea for a story. Maybe you still don't want to build a ship, but you say, nah, asteroid, I don't like it. Let's have a living spaceship, some spaceborne creature, where the people, the crew lives inside the body of that creature, like an animal. Or if you read Dan Simmons' Hyperion series, you would also encounter trees as spaceships very strange. Maybe you want to say, I don't like this idea of space travel at all, but I like to have a story that takes place on different planets. You still can do that. You can have some kind of teleportation or a stargate or whatever you want to call it, where you just can move from one planet to another without any vessel in it. A variant of that would be that the stargate is, in fact, um, a device for not for transporting people, but for transporting spaceships. Maybe it needs to be in open space. You still need a spaceship for the intra-system flight to the Stargate, then get transported there and get out at the other end. The attractive thing about that is that this kind of concept makes these Stargates points of strategic value for your story as well. And last but not least, the generation ship. You have the combination of the idea of interstellar travel, but not faster than light travel. So a group of people starts the voyage, but it will take decades or probably even hundreds of years. So people are born, live and die aboard this ship, generations of people, therefore the name generation ship. And they are completely isolated from the rest, from the remaining universe. So how do they develop? How does society develop in that confined space? If you want to write a story about that, you would write about the voyage of the starship. And then finally, the starship would reach its destination, but the people that are on board right now, they never wanted to go there. It was their ancestors who wanted to go there generations ago. So how do they feel about the end of the voyage and about the destination that they reached? That opens up a huge potential for stories, but that's not in our shipyard. That's a different story.